Moving on to episode 7, the Kimberly teachers appeared to be gathering in a certain place. They were observing Mrs. Vanessa torturing an intruder. Vanessa seemed capable of transforming her right hand into a living creature. It wasn't just the teachers. Esmeralda, the head of Kimberly's school, was also present. In other words, they were the people Oliver was targeting. They wanted to discuss the issue of Darius, who had been missing for 4 months. If it had been that long, it could be assumed that he was dead. However, the teachers argued that Darius wasn't an amateur who would die so easily in the labyrinth, so it's possible that someone killed him. Vanessa suggested that the killer might be among the 6 of them. It could also be Garland or McFarlane. Upon hearing their names mentioned, Theodore McFarlane revealed himself. As already known, Theodore is Michelle's father. Setting that aside, Esmeralda asked to make sure that Darius' killer was not among them. If not, then one of them would be considered an enemy. Suddenly, Vanessa asked, "What if the culprit is a Kimberly student?" Esmeralda's opinion wouldn't change. That person would regret their actions. At night, Pete seemed restless in his sleep. Moreover, his entire body felt hot. Suddenly, he woke up in shock. When Pete tried to unbutton his shirt to cool down, he noticed something different about his body and screamed. This woke Oliver up, who was worried. However, Pete didn't want Oliver to come near him. In the morning during class, his friends were also concerned about Pete's changed behavior. Katie asked if Guy had done something to him. Of course, Guy got into an argument with Katie because he was accused. Pete got annoyed listening to them and said he just wanted to be left alone today. Meanwhile, Michelle happened to meet her acquaintances, Stacy Cornwallis and Faye Willock. Stacy seemed to ignore Michelle's greeting, and Faye reminded her that Michelle was a member of the prominent McFarlane family. Nevertheless, Stacy remained indifferent and told Faye to keep walking. Minot then asked if Michelle knew them. Michelle explained that Stacy was her relative and Faye was Stacy's servant. For some reason, Stacy had been avoiding Michelle since the induction ceremony. Not long after that, the teacher for this class arrived. He was Dustin Hedges, the flying broom studies instructor. Katie had been eagerly anticipating this class. It seemed that new students could only join after half a year. Meanwhile, Nanao appeared anxious about this class. She could still understand flying with living creatures, but it felt strange to her to use just a broom. Oliver wanted to clarify Nanao's misunderstanding. He then explained that a broom couldn't fly. Afterward, Mr. Dustin opened the door to a building. Mr. Dustin explained that this building was the broom house. As could be seen, many brooms were flying around on their own inside after seeing it firsthand. Nanao understood that the brooms in this building were living beings, not objects. More precisely, they were magical creatures of the broom family and Besom genus. Their primary source of sustenance was magical particles in the atmosphere, spirits, and also magical energy from a witch. In return, they were willing to fly alongside the witch. However, the witch and their broom had to be a good match first. That's why Mr. Dustin asked the students to find their broom partner first. Unlike the others, Oliver brought his own broom. He was already acquainted with his broom. Suddenly, the class became excited because many brooms surrounded Nanao. It was no wonder they liked Nanao, given her magical energy. However, Nanao seemed more interested in a broom that was in a corner by itself. Mr. Dustin warned that the broom was very wild. Oliver seemed to recognize that broom. Nanao didn't heed Mr. Dustin's words and approached it anyway. As Nanao tried to touch it, the broom swayed from side to side. Nanao was reminded of her beloved horse, Akikaz. Initially, Akikaz had also resisted like that broom. Nanao understood that the broom only accepted its original master. She said she wouldn't force it. However, she stated that she liked the broom. Suddenly, the broom flew up and then descended into Nanao's grasp. How magical it was, Nanao immediately flew out with the broom. Mr. Dustin himself was surprised, even though he had tried several times and kept failing. Mitchell was also impressed, as inexperienced individuals usually struggled when flying with their first broom. Oliver, seeing Nanao fly, was now certain of one thing. The broom had previously been used by her mother. He never expected the broom to choose Nanao. After class, they took a break in the cafeteria. Nanao still felt excited and couldn't wait for the next magic broom class. Katie felt the same way, but she had only found her broom partner and hadn't flown yet. Meanwhile, Guy and Pete hadn't found anything at all. Speaking of Pete, he was still behaving the same way as he did in the morning. He wanted to go to the next class right away. The next class was alchemy. For the past few months, they had been taught by substitute teachers, so they were curious about Mr. Darius. There were rumors that he had disappeared in the labyrinth. There were also rumors that he had quarreled with other teachers or had been killed by a witch with a grudge against Kimberly. Suddenly, they were surprised when a man joined the conversation. That man was none other than Theodore, Michaela's father. Pete had long admired Theodore. He had even read many of his books. Theodore also noticed Nanao there. After all, he was the one who had invited Nanao to Kimberly all the way from Asia. By the way, Theodore had come here to teach. Yes, coincidentally, he was the substitute teacher for the alchemy class. Before starting a lesson, Theodore asked if anyone in the class had read his book, Journey to the East. Stacy replied that she was currently reading the 12th volume and seemed pleased to be praised by her uncle. However, Pete didn't want to be outdone. He said he had also read it and had one question. In the 25th edition of the second volume, there was a description that had changed from the first edition due to revisions. He wanted to know the reason for the change. Theodore was impressed that Pete had read all the volumes. Pete also said he had read them 3 times. The other students were also impressed. Meanwhile, Stacy felt embarrassed because she couldn't match Pete's accomplishment. After that, they attended a new class, which was the magic engineering class. The instructor was Enrico Forghieri. Mr. Enrico had the appearance of an eccentric old scientist and, for some reason, always carried lollipops. Today, Mr. Enrico asked the students to disassemble and analyze completed magical items to learn their operational principles. He provided 4 boxes that functioned as magical traps. The boxes would activate after 1 hour. The students had to deactivate them within the time limit to avoid the traps. Of course, they would work in groups. After trying for a while, there was now only 1 minute left. The students had successfully deactivated 3 of the boxes. There was one left that was quite challenging to reach its core magical component. With time running out, Oliver decided they should go as far away as possible to avoid getting caught in the trap. However, suddenly Pete began to feel unwell. He fell right next to one of the boxes. Whether he liked it or not, Oliver had to protect Pete from whatever might come out of the trap. When the time ran out, the trap released a swarm of snakes. Oliver was bitten several times while shielding Pete. Guy was no longer afraid after realizing it was just snakes inside. He splashed water on them and then cast a nitrous to electrocute all the snakes. Guy was accustomed to dealing with pests in his hometown. Mr. Enrico congratulated them for passing the first lesson. Then he'd eat them lollipops, claiming they were antidotes to poison. Pete felt guilty about Oliver. Oliver didn't mind it at all. He just whispered that he wanted to discuss the changes Pete had undergone. Pete was already convinced after touching Pete's body earlier. His gender had been switched. Oliver explained that this unique condition was very rare even in the world of magic. This condition was called reversy. For a witch, this condition was considered a talent. To make it clearer, Oliver asked Pete to try reciting the lightning mantra. The mantra was difficult for Pete to master, but now he could recite it with strong offensive power. It seemed that male and female bodies controlled different elements. However, there was no exception with the reversy condition. When Oliver was about to explain further, he realized that someone was eavesdropping. The person immediately revealed themselves. It was Carlos Whitrow. Actually, Carlos didn't intend to eavesdrop, but he had suspected this would happen ever since he first met Pete. Plus, he happened to see Pete behaving strangely today. He then invited Pete to a meeting at 8 p.m. At the meeting time, Pete asked Oliver to accompany him. The student council president, Godfrey, was waiting for them. He would guide them to the meeting inside the labyrinth. As the head of the student council, they always checked all the events held in the labyrinth. He felt responsible and apologized for the incident in the Colosseum and the incident with Vera. Shortly after that, they arrived in a hidden room. Many students had gathered there. Godfrey explained that this place was where students with gender-related magical anomalies gathered. Pete was warmly welcomed by the students there. In the midst of their conversation, the sound of a violin suddenly echoed in the room. Oliver was surprised to see that the violinist was his cousin Gwen. The violin melody was the opening for Carlos' singing performance. After giving his opening greetings, Carlos immediately sang beautifully, accompanied by the violin. Oliver realized it was an enchanting voice magic, but not the seductive type. His voice was much purer and cleaner. Pete was still feeling anxious, but now he felt he could coexist with his condition. Oliver asked if Pete wanted to change rooms. Pete replied that he didn't want to be alone at night at Kimberly. For now, he wanted to share a room with Oliver. As they both returned to the dormitory, they made up an excuse about going for mantra practice. Of course, the others were worried because they suddenly disappeared. At that moment, someone was spying on them from inside a building.